The Shadow in the Corner by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rosie. The Shadow in the Corner by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Wildheath Grange stood a little way back from the road, with a barren stretch of heath behind it, and a few tall fir trees, with straggling, wind-tossed heads, for its only shelter. It was a lonely house on a lonely road, little better than a lane, leading across a desolate waste of sandy fields to the seashore, and it was a house that bore a bad name among the natives of the village of Holcroft, which was the nearest place where humanity might be found. It was a good old house, nevertheless, substantially built in the days when there was no stint of stone and timber, a good old grey stone house with many gables, deep window seats, and a wide staircase, long dark passages, hidden doors in queer corners, closets as large as some modern rooms, and cellars in which a company of soldiers might have lain perdu. This spacious old mansion was given over to rats and mice, loneliness, echoes, and the occupation of three elderly people: Michael Bascom, whose forebears had been landowners of importance in the neighborhood, and his two servants, Daniel Skegg and his wife, who had served the owner of that grim old house ever since he left the university, where he had lived 15 years of his life, 5 as student and 10 as professor of natural science. At 33, Michael Bascom had seemed a middle-aged man. At 56, he looked and moved and spoke like an old man. During that interval of 23 years, he had lived alone in Wildheath Grange, and the country people told each other that the house had made him what he was. This was a fanciful and superstitious notion on their parts, doubtless, yet it would not have been difficult to have traced a certain affinity between the dull grey building and the man who lived in it. Both seemed alike remote from the common cares and interests of humanity. Both had an air of settled melancholy, engendered by perpetual solitude. Both had the same faded complexion, the same look of slow decay. Yet, lonely as Michael Bascom's life was at Wildheath Grange, he would not on any account have altered its tenor. He had been glad to exchange the comparative seclusion of college rooms for the unbroken solitude of Wildheath. He was a fanatic in his love of scientific research, and his quiet days were filled to the brim with labors that seldom failed to interest and satisfy him. There were periods of depression, occasional moments of doubt, when the goal towards which he strove seemed unattainable, and his spirit fainted within him. Happily, such times were rare with him. He had a dogged power of continuity which ought to have carried him to the highest pinnacle of achievement, and which perhaps might ultimately have won for him a grand name and world-wide renown, but for a catastrophe which burdened the declining years of his harmless life with an unconquerable remorse. One autumn morning, when he had lived just 23 years at Wildheath, and had only lately begun to perceive that his faithful butler and body servant, who was middle-aged when he first employed him, was actually getting old, Mr. Bascom's breakfast meditations over the latest treatise on the atomic theory were interrupted by an abrupt demand from that very Daniel Skegg. The man was accustomed to wait upon his master in the most absolute silence, and his sudden breaking out into speech was almost as startling as if the bust of Socrates above the bookcase had burst into human language. "It's no use," said Daniel. "My missus must have a girl." "A what?" demanded Mr. Bascom, without taking his eyes from the line he had been reading. A girl to trot about and wash up and help the old lady. She's getting weak on her legs, poor soul. We've none of us grown younger in the last 20 years. 20 years, echoed Michael Bascom scornfully. What is 20 years in the formation of a strata? What even in the growth of an oak, the cooling of a volcano? Not much, perhaps, but it's apt to tell upon the bones of a human being. The manganese staining to be seen upon some skulls would certainly indicate, began the scientist dreamily. I wish my bones were only as free from rheumatics as they were 20 years ago, pursued Daniel testily, and then, perhaps, I should make light of 20 years. Howsoever, the long and short of it is, my missus must have a girl. She can't go on trotting up and down these everlasting passages and standing in that stone scullery year after year just as if she was a young woman. She must have a girl to help. Let her have 20 girls, said Mr. Bascom, going back to his book. What's the use of talking like that, sir? 20 girls indeed. We should have rare work to get one. Because the neighborhood is sparsely populated? Interrogated Mr. Bascom, still reading. No, sir, because this house is known to be haunted. Michael Bascom laid down his book and turned a look of grave reproach upon his servant. Skegg, he said in a severe voice, I thought you had lived long enough with me to be superior to any folly of that kind. "I don't say that I believe in ghosts," answered Daniel, with a semi-apologetic air, "but the country people do. There's not a mortal among 'em that will venture across our threshold after nightfall. Merely because Anthony Bascom, who led a wild life in London, and lost his money and land, came home here broken-hearted, and is supposed to have destroyed himself in this house, the only remnant of property that was left him out of a fine estate." "Supposed to have destroyed himself!" cried Skegg. "Why, the fact is as well known as the death of Queen Elizabeth, or the Great Fire of London. Why, wasn't he buried at the cross-roads between here and Holcroft?" "An idle tradition, for which you could produce no substantial proof," retorted Mr. Bascom. "I don't know about proof, but the country people believe it as firmly as they believe their gospel. If their faith in the gospel was a little stronger, they need not trouble themselves about Anthony Bascom." "Well," grumbled Daniel, as he began to clear the table, "a girl of some kind we must get, but she'll have to be a foreigner, or a girl that's hard driven for a place." When Daniel Skegg said a foreigner, he did not mean the native of some distant clime, but a girl who had not been born and bred at Holcroft. Daniel had been raised and reared in that insignificant hamlet, and, small and dull as it was, he considered the world beyond it only margin. Michael Bascom was too deep in the atomic theory to give a second thought to the necessities of an old servant. Mrs. Skegg was an individual with whom he rarely came in contact. She lived, for the most part, in a gloomy region at the north end of the house, where she ruled over the solitude of a kitchen that looked like a cathedral, and numerous offices of the sculler, larder, and pantry class, where she carried on a perpetual warfare with spiders and beetles, and wore her old life out in the labor of sweeping and scrubbing. She was a woman of severe aspect, dogmatic piety, and a bitter tongue. She was a good plain cook, and ministered diligently to her master's wants. He was not an epicure, but liked his life to be smooth and easy, and the equilibrium of his mental power would have been disturbed by a bad dinner. He heard no more about the proposed addition to his household for a space of 10 days, when Daniel Skegg again startled him amidst his studious repose by the abrupt announcement, "I've got a girl!" "Oh," said Michael Bascom, "have you?" And he went on with his book. This time he was reading an essay on phosphorus and its functions in relation to the human brain. "Yes," pursued Daniel, in his usual grumbling tone, "she was a waif and a stray, or I shouldn't have got her. If she'd been a native, she'd never have come to us." "I hope she's respectable," said Michael. "Respectable! That's the only fault she has, poor thing. She's too good for the place. She's never been in service before, but she says she's willing to work, and I dare say my old woman will be able to break her in. Her father was a small tradesman at Yarmouth. He died a month ago, and left this poor thing homeless. Mrs. Midge at Holcroft is her aunt, and she said to the girl, 'Come and stay with me till you get a place,' and the girl has been staying with Mrs. Midge for the last 3 weeks, trying to hear of a place. When Mrs. Midge heard that my missus wanted a girl to help, she thought it would be the very thing for her niece Maria. Luckily Maria had heard nothing about this house, so the poor innocent dropped me a curtsy and said she'd be thankful to come, and would do her best to learn her duty. She'd had an easy time of it with her father, who had educated her above her station, like a fool as he was," growled Daniel. "By your own account, I'm afraid you've made a bad bargain," said Michael. "You don't want a young lady to clean kettles and pans." "If she was a young duchess, my old woman would make her work," retorted Skegg decisively. "And pray, where are you going to put this girl?" asked Mr. Bascom, rather irritably. "I can't have a strange young woman tramping up and down the passages outside my room. You know what a wretched sleeper I am, Skegg. A mouse behind the wainscot is enough to wake me." "I've thought of that," answered the butler, with his look of ineffable wisdom. "I'm not going to put her on your floor. She's to sleep in the attics." "Which room?" "The big one at the north end of the house. That's the only ceiling that doesn't let water. She might as well sleep in a shower bath as in any of the other attics." "The room at the north end," repeated Mr. Bascom thoughtfully. "Isn't that—" "Of course it is," snapped Skegg, "but she doesn't know anything about it." Mr. Bascom went back to his books, and forgot all about the orphan from Yarmouth, until one morning, on entering his study, he was startled by the appearance of a strange girl, in a neat black and white cotton gown, busy dusting the volumes which were stacked in blocks upon his spacious writing-table, and doing it with such deft and careful hands that he had no inclination to be angry at this unwonted liberty. Old Mrs. Skegg had religiously refrained from all such dusting, on the plea that she did not wish to interfere with the master's ways. One of the master's ways, therefore, had been to inhale a good deal of dust in the course of his studies. The girl was a slim little thing, with a pale and somewhat old-fashioned face, flaxen hair, braided under a neat muslin cap, a very fair complexion, and light blue eyes. They were the lightest blue eyes Michael Bascom had ever seen, but there was a sweetness and gentleness in their expression which atoned for their insipid colour. "I hope you do not object to my dusting your books, sir," she said, dropping a curtsy. She spoke with a quaint precision which struck Michael Bascom as a pretty thing in its way. "No, I don't object to cleanliness, so long as my books and papers are not disturbed. If you take a volume off my desk, replace it on the spot you took it from. That's all I ask." "I will be very careful, sir." "When did you come here?" "Only this morning, sir." The student seated himself at his desk, and the girl withdrew, drifting out of the room as noiselessly as a flower blown across the threshold. Michael Bascom looked after her curiously. He had seen very little of youthful womanhood in his dry as dust career, and he wondered at this girl as a creature